Communication. Communication is essential to how we work and how we function and, general life skills. It's important to be able to share ideas, express feelings, and avoid conflict using communication. Sure, at its core, communication is simply being able to share information, like how I'm communicating to you about communication information. But it's also so much more than that. There are broader categories of styles people tend to use to communicate. There are 4 main styles. 1. Passive. 2. Aggressive. 3. Passive-aggressive. And 4. Assertive. That's the one you want to be. So let's just jump into it. Let's talk about all the 4 types of communication styles. What are passive communicators like? Passive communicators don't really express their needs and they have a hard time saying no. They kind of have a problem with eye contact and kind of have bad posture, but these people tend to be followers and they tend to get along well with other people. What's next? Aggressive communicators. What are they like? Well, they're right and you're wrong. No, but that's what they think. They tend to be domineering in conversations and they don't really listen to other people, but a lot of the time, they tend to be leaders because they can command respect from people. Okay, so the passive-aggressive communicator. They might seem passive, but they're actually aggressive. What does that mean? Okay, so passive-aggressive communicators, they might seem like they're getting along, but they're actually not. They often deny that there's an issue, and a lot of the time, they can't even recognize their own anger. These people tend to use body language to express themselves, but they're not very confrontational. Lastly, but not leastly, we have the assertive communicators. And these people, objectively, not objectively, they are the best communicators out of all of these. These people are able to express their own needs accurately and use I statements such as I think or I feel, which doesn't put the blame on other people, and which, is good for communication. These people, they own their feelings and they're not accusatory, unlike aggressive people. They are good at eye contact. Trust me, you want to be an assertive communicator. So those are the 4 main basic types of communication. But it actually turns out that being in a minority community, such as being LGBT, might actually have an impact on your communication style. There's limited research that suggests that people in same-sex relationships are actually better at being an assertive communicator in that relationship than people who aren't. Is this reserved for just same-sex couples, or is this more broadly for all of the LGBT community? There are dogs barking. Can you hear them? And I want to see if this actually expands more broadly to LGBT people instead of just, people in same-sex relationships. If same-sex couples tend to have more assertive communication, then do all LGBT people have more assertive communication styles? So today, we're going to dive into that. Do LGBT people have more assertive communication styles? Let's find out. It's time for the method section! How is communication actually operationalized? How is it? Someone tell me. Just kidding. I know how to do it. I did the study. Let's operationalize, baby. So, first thing I did, I actually made a study. I know, congratulations me. I did the bare minimum. So I took the prevalent characteristics of each of the 4 communication styles, and I developed 5 questions for each one. Let's take the question I made. I have a hard time maintaining eye contact, which is a passive question. From there, I had people answer from a scale of 1 to 4. 1 being strongly disagree, and 4 being strongly agree. You may be asking, why didn't I make this from a 1 to 5 scale so there could be a neutral option? Because maybe you don't agree with it, so you just want to answer 3 as a neutral option. I want results. That is literally the only answer. I want results. We're gonna assign people point values depending on what answer they chose. If you answered a 1, you get 1 point. If you answered a 4, you get 4 points. It's easy. From there, I'm gonna add all the points together in each communication style category, and whichever style ended up having the most points is actually the style I'm gonna assign you. So let's say you have more points for passive communication. You got 20 points, while comparatively the other categories got 12 points and 14 points. Congratulations, you're a passive communicator, my friend, at least according to my survey. We did it! We figured out what people's communication styles are! How do we know who's LGBT? That is where the demographic questions come in. So I'm deciding people into one of two categories: LGBT or cisgender, heterosexual, cishet for short. So cisgender means that you identify as the gender you were assigned at birth. So if you were born a male, you identify as a male. And heterosexual means you're straight, you're attracted to the opposite sex. To identify all this, I made 4 demographic questions. The first one being, what is your gender? So if you fall into male or female, congratulations, you're cisgender. If you don't, like you identify as a transgender male or female, you're non-binary, you're agender, you're gender fluid, you just fall out of the typical gender binary of male and female, congratulations, you're LGBT. Second question I developed was, what is your sexual orientation? But basically, if you answer anything but heterosexual, straight, you're LGBT. If you're gay or lesbian or bisexual or pansexual or, you know, in general, if you fall out of anything that's not cisgender or heterosexual, I'm putting you in the category of LGBT. Some people who participated in my survey didn't get counted. Well, if they're questioning their sexuality or questioning their gender, I didn't really want to count them because they're not quite as definitively one category or the other. There were 2 more demographic questions I asked. What is your age, and what are the genders of the people in your current or most recent sexual relationship? We'll come back to those questions though. From there, I sent it all over the place. I sent it to Reddit, I sent it to Instagram, I sent it to Discord. Whee! Everyone gets to take the survey. I got a bunch of people. But is that non-biased, and is it a good way to get people to take your survey? No. Welcome to the results section, my friends. Okay, I'm gonna be super honest, this section was actually really hard to write out, so please give me your best listening attention, I deserve it. Anyway, come check out my cool graphs. Out of all 77 total communicators, that 55% of them actually fit into assertive, which was a little surprised about. I didn't think people would be that good of being assertive communicators. And only 23% of people actually fell into passive communication styles. But this whole thing right here is just a graph of everyone. So let's break it down into 2 more graphs. Fractions! Cisgender heterosexual people and LGBT people. It turns out that almost 2/3 of the cishet population has an assertive communication style compared to almost half of the LGBT population. It's also kind of interesting to note that the LGBT population also had more variation in results. They had a lot more people who responded that they had a passive communication style. 27% of people who are LGBT had a passive communication style compared to only the 18% of the cisgender heterosexual people. What's the statistical significance of this? Beats me. Mr. Tuttle told me not to do advanced statistical analysis, so I didn't. You're gonna have to take this at face value. Despite the fact that nearly 1/3 of my respondents were LGBT, a good half of that population responded that they were in man and woman relationships, which I thought was really interesting. It's also interesting to note that, nearly 2/3 of the people who responded to my study were between the ages of 18 and 24, which, it's fine, it limits generalizability, but whatever. Okay, math is over, I'm done with the data, we're over here. Now let's figure out, what does any of this mean? Hi, welcome to the Thought Bubble. You can tell we lost a lot of budget. My name is Hank Green, let's dive into it. I didn't expect the data because the data suggests that cisgender heterosexual people are better at assertive communication and that LGBT people are more passive communicators than, cishet people, which was the opposite of my hypothesis. So there are a few potential explanations to this, but my first guess is that it could be because of mental illness. Let's get out my dear old laptop, which has all my fun notes on it. Studies say that LGBT people have higher rates of reported mental illness and depression and anxiety and, higher drinking rates, higher suicide rates, way more than people who are cisgender and heterosexual. Part of this might be caused by perceived discrimination and internalized homophobic attitudes. Let's say, for example, in a work environment, if a gay person felt as if they had to act straight and the people around there weren't accepting, that could be part of the mental health issues. But social anxiety is actually one of the biggest tells to see if someone is a passive communicator. If you feel anxious, you might not want to share your opinions, which causes your needs to not be met, which makes you more of a passive communicator, which makes you more socially anxious, and so on and so forth. And this really sucks, because studies also suggest that LGBT people have even more unmet mental health needs than cisgender heterosexual people. What is another possible explanation for LGBT people being more passive communicators, though? Well, in groups and out in groups. Naturally forming groups such as being LGBT and being not LGBT, being cishet, can create communication differences among groups. There's a lot of heterosexual bias in language and anti-gay language, which can create a power dynamic between these two groups. This can push LGBT people into a submissive and passive position, potentially altering the way in which LGBT people communicate. But all of this goes against the study which I mentioned earlier, which said that same-sex couples are more assertive communicators. So let's circle back a bit. Let's get a little more broad. Half of the LGBT respondents reported being in a relationship with the opposite gender. Data suggests that LGBT people in same-sex relationships tend to have more assertive communication, but this may be dependent on whether or not that person is actually in a same-sex relationship, not just being LGBT altogether. Part of this could be caused that same-sex relationships, those people are in the same in-group, being LGBT, which can foster likeness. Being both the same sex and LGBT, which is a tight-knit community, can create better communication among individuals who consider themselves close to each other on the basis of something highly personal: gender identity and sexuality. So LGBT people might exercise more care for one another on the basis of finding comfort around LGBT people, their in-group, as opposed to cishet people who don't really have a community on the senses regarding their sexuality or gender identity. This is because they were never discriminated against on the basis of sexuality, and therefore are not as closely united. Again, I keep bringing it up, same-sex relationships tend to have more assertive communication, but what if this also expands to LGBT opposite-sex relationships? Because the LGBT community is tight-knit and supporting. It's also worth noting that the LGBT community has a history of not being as strict with gender roles compared to cishet people, whereas gender roles can negatively impact communication. Let's think. Same-sex relationships and opposite-sex relationships have differences a lot of the time rooted in sexism as regard to topics such as gender roles. Like men, they're told not to cry, which, limits the way they communicate their feelings, which leads to anger, which, is a whole thing about toxic masculinity. It's a whole thing on itself, and we're not really going to dive into it in this video. Women, on the other hand, they might feel like they have to roll with the punches or act more passively because historically, that was their role. But all of this, the LGBT community doesn't really put as much emphasis on these gender roles compared to cishet people. This might not explain the higher assertive communication styles for cishet people like the survey found, but it might serve as an explanation for higher assertive communication style in same-sex relationships. So, with all of this said, how can we help LGBT people communicate more assertively outside of same-sex relationships? So support groups have helped, but they're not perfect. And a lot of the studies taken about relationship and communication styles, they don't really take into account the experiences of marginalized communities like the LGBT community. It mostly takes into account, the experiences of cisgender heterosexual people. Many of these differences are impacted by social stigma or prejudice that aren't typically found in heteronormative relationships. So, being LGBT, having to introduce your same-sex partner to your parents isn't always easily navigated. A lot of the time it comes with social stigma, or it's something that no one's really ever taught. Your parents questioning the legitimacy of your relationship, or more family disapproval than there usually would be. A lot of the stigma comes from unfamiliarity with the LGBT population, or just having rigid worldviews when it comes to gender and sexuality. So, how do we help these people? How do we develop a program? Well, let's create one right now. Program! A potential program that could help LGBT people navigate same-sex relationships and gender non-conforming relationships that don't typically stick to normal gender roles. It could help them learn to cope with outside negative stigma that they receive and, unteach the notion that a heteronormative relationship, a man with woman relationship, is the normal relationship. All of this could help LGBT people come out to their parents, accept their own relationship, and being comfortable outside of the typical heteronormative social views, which, can help provide a lot of guidance to a marginalized community, which it often gets ignored. It doesn't get the help it really needs sometimes. Okay, but everything I just said, this whole video, it's a little speculative. There are a lot of issues with my survey, a lot of unavoidable issues. I did my best to avoid bias, but there are issues. Okay, my sampling wasn't random, it was convenient sampling, and most of the respondents were really young, so it's not generalizable. But to be fair, I'm a college student living in a global pandemic with $0 to help fund this whatsoever. I'm filming in my garage right now. What can I do? I have to make a finale right now. Whoops. It's hard to know whether or not being LGBT is actually negatively or positively impacting communication styles. This study was a little bit inconclusive. It's hard to really know what's actually going on. Take my study with a massive grain of salt, please. Even though studies have found that people in same-sex relationships may have more assertive communication, again, the studies are limited. There's not a lot of science about this. I really tried to find a study that did the same thing that I did, and I couldn't, because I just don't think there's a lot of attention on this, because a lot of people focus on how to communicate to LGBT people rather than how do LGBT people actually communicate. A lot of it is seen as like an in-group versus out-group difference. It hopefully shouldn't negatively impact communication styles, but oftentimes it does. So people will look down on you because, you're gay and blah, blah, blah. But it's really interesting to think about. It's also worth mentioning that as an individual, you should do your best to try to be an assertive communicator. You should do your best to try to communicate your own needs so you can get help from other people, so other people can take care of you. Make sure that you can say no. That's like, when my parents eat Indian food and they're like, hey, Hannah, we're gonna get Indian food. I'm like, no, I don't want to get Indian food. Indian food is nasty. That's me being an assertive communicator. I'm saying no. I'm putting my foot down. I think that Indian food is nasty. They're allowed to have their own feelings, but it's nasty. But do your best, everyone. Take care of yourselves. Please make sure to take care of yourself and do your best to be the best communicator you can be, and make sure that your needs are met, because you deserve it. You really, really do. Bye.